called Reconstructing the Rubble. And this first image here is a project that I think virtually every architect watching this will be familiar with. Of course, it's the Ronchamp Chapel by Le Corbusier, 1955. But I think a less familiar aspect of this building that you see from this image is the fact that it is constructed with the rubble stone of a previous church, which has stood in the same location, but which had been destroyed by aerial bombardment in the Second World War. And I think this is a very interesting thing to me because while reusing destruction rubble or reusing the remains of old buildings was a very common practice in the pre-industrial era, in our own time, because of the kind of rigidness and prescriptive nature of construction technology, also because of building codes and other modern requirements to building, this practice of reusing materials obviously much more difficult and far less common, almost never happens. And there's a very nice line from James Sterling about this approach, which comes from an essay he wrote about this building in 1956 after visiting it. And it was published in the Architectural Review. The title of the review that he gave is Le Corbusier's Chapel and the Crisis of Rationalism. And again, speaking about the use of rubble to build, he says, in the USA, functionalism now means the adaptation of building to industrialized processes and products. But in Europe, it remains the essentially humanist method of designing to a specific use. So here, Sterling's calling Ronchamp a functionalist building, even though it doesn't really meet our generic aesthetic requirement for one. But he's, of course, alluding to the fact that you have the stone on site. It is a material that can be used, and Corbusier, looking at the circumstances, decided to use the material. And this is an image of the church under construction that was in Sterling's, a part of Sterling's essay in the Architectural Review. Now, as it happens, Sterling's definition of functionalism very much mirrors one that Le Corbusier gave over and over and over again throughout his career, particularly to justify his more so-called vernacular projects. The kind of earliest one is the Villa Errázuriz, which he designed in 1929 for a rural site on the coastline of Chile. And speaking about this project, Corbusier wrote, in an area where no sufficient technical resources were available, one had to compose with local existing elements and with an unsophisticated way of building. Walls of large blocks of stone, a framework of tree trunks, and roofing of local tiles. The rusticity of the building materials, however, in no way acts as an obstacle to a clear plan and a modern expression. So again, we see here a functionalist justification of a building that does not quite look like what we expect from a functionalist building. In fact, what we normally expect from a functionalist building, and I know Corbusier, well, this is functionalism, modernism kind of get mixed up. It's somewhat interchangeable sometimes people more specific, but generally when we speak about functionalism or modernism, we tend to go back to the somewhat limited definition that is outlined by Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson in 1932 with their international style thesis. And we see here in the international style book the kind of modernism that Hitchcock and Johnson were advocating for. The Villa Savoie completed around 1930. I thought it was 29, but it says 30 in the book. And then you have, in 1931, the Villa Mandrot, also by Le Corbusier, but a very different kind of building built from rubble stone. And this building was something of a difficulty for Hitchcock and Johnson because it doesn't really meet their thesis. It doesn't really qualify under the international style definition. They were kind of forced to publish it because it was by Le Corbusier and they couldn't get around it. They had to admit it existed. But Hitchcock, in the preface, the 1966 edition to the international style, does say that this was really a big problem for them, and they included the building as a kind of exception to the rule, but admits that it was not very convincing. So, and I'll just give briefly this here. This is the Sextant, Villa Sextant of 1935, and this is a drawing that was published in 1940 survey called The New Architecture by Alfred Roth Again, I'm not going to read the quote for the sake of time, but he describes this as also a functionalist building. So where I'm going with all this is the fact that, within the framework of modern architecture, and we're no longer really in the modern era, but within the framework of contemporary architecture that comes from modernism, we have sort of lost a certain flexibility, and we have very much kind of returned to a more narrow understanding of how buildings can be constructed, and a more limited repertoire of techniques. Now, the fact is that we actually do exist within a world where we have constant warfare, we have natural disasters, buildings are sometimes demolished voluntarily, usually for real estate, due to the pressure of real estate. And so we do find ourselves in the kind of inescapable cycle of demolition or destruction and reconstruction. And I think one of the great problems with this infinite cycle is the fact that we do now have this critical climate situation, which is manifested both through global warming, but also through the endless exploitation of natural resources. And so, as you probably guessed, this is an image taken from Gaza. So what you do about this situation, you would have to, in conventional terms, remove all the rubble, which is basically everything. That would become landfill. Then you would have to get new materials, ship it in. That new material would probably be made from new resources that are newly extracted. There's transportation both in the removal of material and the bringing of new material. It's an extremely carbon-intensive exercise, and it might seem kind of ridiculous to think of carbon, in such a situation, but ultimately this is the situation we're in. Everything is part of this overall problem. And I just wanted to I show these images to show kind of what kind of debris you get out of the buildings. Large pieces of concrete, you get concrete block, bricks sometimes, and a lot of dust. This is from Syria. This is from Ukraine. So you see chunks of brick. This is from Lebanon from last week. So, of course, the obvious question that comes from this is, well, how exactly can we use this material? Because, after all, this is not as simple as piecing together stones like Le Corbusier did at Ronchamp. And I just very quickly, I want to read a criticism that Craig Elwood, the American architect Craig Elwood, made of Ronchamp. He said, "Can we, with our machine economy, truly justify a crafted architecture? I don't think so. Our economy dictates that machine products and machine techniques be the essence of our buildings." This is a building by Elwood from the same year he made that criticism, giving you the kind of the machine aesthetic. However, as it happens, Corbusier, at the very beginning of his career, actually presents an industrialized solution to how to use rubble to build new buildings. He proposed asbestos boxes that you would take rubble. This is a project in 1919, so it's the end of the First World War, and you could pack it up into the boxes and you can assemble them into new buildings. What I was thinking is by no means a new technique, an old one, is the use of gabion walls. And a gabion is a kind of a mesh cage that you pack in stone or other hard materials. Oftentimes brick is also used. And this is usually used for civil projects, kind of landscaping, retaining walls. But there have also been examples where people have experimented using this in buildings. So this is a University of Nevada prototype of 1977, load-bearing gabion walls. This is a project by Ian Ritchie in London, 1993. It's a regatta center in London. These are not load-bearing. And then probably the most obvious example is Herzog de Meuron in Napa Valley. Again, not load-bearing. And you can see it in this section. It's been constructed in front of a full concrete wall, so it's really just cladding, to be honest. These are gabion houses that were built in Heishi in 2010 after the 2000 earthquake. These are load-bearing gabion walls. This is our experimental building by the architect Doug Eichelberger in Colorado, using load-bearing gabions. This is a building in Morocco. It's a women's center. This is a construction photo, of course. The roof has not gone on yet. And you can see that, again, load-bearing details from that. Okay. So, as you can see, most examples I gave of kind of the load-bearing gabion are for humanitarian purposes or smaller buildings. I think this has to do with the fact that in the developed world, we preclude certain techniques, thinking that they're not appropriate for our society, while at the same time thinking they are appropriate in other, say, less wealthy countries. I do think there is opportunity for us to study how these techniques, in fact, could be used in kind of what you might call more ordinary circumstances. And I propose four, but you see here three. A is just a standard wall with brick cladding. So B shows you could use rubble as cladding as a kind of encapsulation technique to reduce landfill. C is a hybrid approach where you could use the structural properties of gabion walls combined with more conventional structure if the gabion wall itself cannot be load-bearing. That's probably most likely the code reasons. And D would be the idea of using purely a load-bearing gabion wall. Just very briefly, because you'd also get a lot of dust and smaller debris in these situations, I was also thinking you could use geocells and you could combine that with earth, and so you could still use that finer material to build up a wall. And just very briefly, it's a diagram showing B is a kind of combination or a geocell gabion hybrid, which I think is a possible way to build an exterior wall for a building. And I'll leave it there. It's just a drawing of the whole idea. Thank you.